So welcome to the first event in our speaker series. Many of you will know me, but for those who don't, my name is Eric Story. I'm the outreach manager here at the Laurier Centre for the Study of Canada. Before we begin, I'd like to just do a brief land acknowledgement. We at the Laurier Centre for the Study of Canada would like to acknowledge that we are located on the traditional territories of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples, and we recognize the continuing presence of Indigenous peoples and cultures here. The consequences of the long colonial relationship between the Government of Canada and First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples are far-reaching and painful. We are committed to reconciliation through the establishment and maintenance of a mutually respectful relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. Now, for some of you that are in the room, you may or may not know, I just realized this today, the Centre has been around for approximately 30 years. And that actually means that we have been running this speaker series for that same amount of time. I believe this is actually our 30th year running the speaker series, which I think is pretty cool. But I think for people here in the room and also for those who are tuning in on Zoom, thank you for tuning in online, wherever you may be tuning in from. You may know that before we were the Laurier Centre for the Study of Canada, we were the Laurier Centre, it's a very long acronym, Laurier Centre for Military, Strategic and Disarmament Studies, which focused primarily on the history of war or military history, but also contemporary conflict. And in the past 3 years, we have undergone a transformation of sorts from the Laurier Military Centre, for short, to the Laurier Centre for the Study of Canada. And I know I've done this a few times, but I want to do it just once more time for those who perhaps don't know, but underpinning the work that we do here at the Laurier Centre for the Study of Canada are 4 collectives. And you can see them represented actually on the logo there on the right hand or the left hand side of the room, right for you guys, left for me. But for those on Zoom, you can take a look at our website and you can see it. But each of the collectives are represented by the 4 colors that you can see in the logo. And I'll go through them starting from the bottom and then make my way around. The bottom one, blue, represents policy connections, the ways in which public policy impacts Canada and how it engages with the world. That's the blue on the bottom. On the left, war and society. It's the legacy programming that we have done through the Laurier Military Centre for so many years in so many good ways, continuing to do that as our second pillar of research here, looking at both the history of war, but also contemporary conflict and its impact on society. Moving up to the top is the orange color, the Orange Collective, and that represents publics and social justice, the ways in which the history and contemporary inequality in societies is studied and understood and experienced by individuals disadvantaged in multiple ways. And then finally, the 4th collective, represented by the yellow color on the right, is the Communities Collective. And we've often found that the Communities Collective is one of the most difficult collectives to engage because it involves such localized knowledge, right? It's the study of local communities, how local communities experience events, as well as how local communities engage with the world around them. And so when I was at Congress this summer, which is kind of the meeting for all of social sciences and humanities, many of the different academic associations, I stumbled across WLU Press's stand selling books, and I came across Miriam Wright's book, Sporting Justice, looking at the Chatham Coloured All-Stars. And I thought, what a terrific book to fit into our Communities Collective. And so I reached out to her, and sure enough, she agreed, and she's here tonight to give a talk for you all. Let me introduce Miriam to you before I hand the mic over to her. Miriam Wright is an associate professor of history at the University of Windsor in the Department of History. Her recent work has focused on race and sport in Canada and on early 20th century Chinese immigration to Newfoundland and Labrador. She co-directed the community-based public history project, Breaking the Color Barrier, Wilfred Boomer Harding, and the Chatham Coloured All-Stars, which included a website launched in 2017, and I'm sure she will speak to that tonight. And if she doesn't, we can ask her questions about it afterwards. Her book, Sporting Justice, The Chatham Coloured All-Stars in Black Baseball in Southwestern Ontario from 1915 to 1958, was published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press in August 2023 this year. And we're very happy to say that Murray here from WLU Press is here to sell books to you all, for those in the room. But for those who are tuning in on Zoom and can't purchase a book online, don't worry, we've got you covered. We'll share a discount code with you shortly in the chat. So tonight, Miriam will be, of course, sharing some of her research about her newest book, Sporting Justice and the Chatham Coloured All-Stars, though she will be focusing on the Great Depression years from 1933 to 1940. I've already said too much. Let me turn things over to our speaker tonight, Miriam Wright.
Right, okay. Thank you very much, Eric. Thank you for the invitation. It's really quite an honor. And thank you to the Laurier Center for the Study of Canada. I've never been here, as I was telling Eric before. We came here, the last time I was on Laurier campus was when I was in grade 13, and I was touring the schools, Laurier and Waterloo, to see if I might come here. I decided not to, but I had a lovely experience anyway, so thank you. Also, thank you to Murray for being here tonight. Murray, as you may know, is managing editor at Wilfrid Laurier University Press. And so he worked closely with me for the past year or so, and it was really great to meet him in person. So thank you. I want to introduce you to the Chatham Coloured All-Stars, and then give you a little brief history of the story itself, how the memory and curation of the story lived within Chatham's Black community for decades, and how and why I became involved with it 8 years ago. It's kind of a longer introduction than I might normally give, but it is connected, I think, to the larger themes I wanted to explore, which is specifically about community, memory, and social justice. So here, picture, you see a picture of the Chatham Coloured All-Stars in 1934. They are a Black baseball team founded in 1933 in Chatham, Ontario. And as many of you may know, Chatham had been a major hub for the Black diaspora in the 19th century, in the years of the Underground Railroad and the influx of free Black people in the wake of the U.S. Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Although the Black population had declined since its height, since before the U.S. Civil War, by the 1930s, there were still over 400 Black people living in Chatham, which had a population of just under 10,000 at the time. Now, Black people in the area had been playing baseball since at least the last quarter of the 19th century, but were largely not included in organized play. An exhibition team, the Chatham Coloured Giants, which played roughly from 1915 through the mid-1920s, played local white, Black, and Indigenous teams, but formal organized white baseball leagues were still largely racially segregated. Finally, in 1933, the Chatham Stars, as the Chatham Coloured All-Stars were known that year, were accepted into the Chatham City Baseball League. Now, I don't know fully why that barrier was broken, but organized baseball was collapsing in Chatham at that time, and I expect that white organizers were simply willing to accept a Black team to keep the game alive. The Chatham City Baseball League was affiliated with the Ontario Baseball Amateur Association, OBAA, which meant that the season winners could move into the provincial playoffs. And I point this out because in the 1930s, there were also many other Black teams in southwestern Ontario, in Windsor, in Chatham, in London, that were also playing in white leagues, but they were in leagues that were not affiliated with the provincial body, and so didn't have the path to a provincial title the way the Chatham Coloured All-Stars did. The All-Stars had a rough first year, but in 1934, with the addition of several strong players, they recruited fastball pitcher and home run specialist Earl Flat Chase from Windsor, catcher Janice Washington, and shortstop Donald Taborn, both of Detroit, and they were much more successful. In fact, that year, they not only won the city championship, but they moved through 4 rounds of playoffs to take the Intermediate B title, the first Black team to do so, and I believe the only Black team to win a provincial championship in Ontario. And if you're not familiar about, levels of baseball, A, B, C, Intermediate A is kind of the top tier of baseball. B is kind of the middle tier. C sort of something like that. So it's sort of a more sort of competitive kind of leveling. The team remained together for 8 years, reaching OBAA playoffs twice before disbanding at the end of the 1940 season. I'm just going to point you to the slide and just have you take a look at, tell you a little bit about some of those players. If you look in the top left and the top right back row, one on the left is Lewis Pryor, the one on the far right is Percy Parker. They were coaches, base coaches for the team. Percy Parker had actually played with the Chatham Coloured Giants, that earlier team that I mentioned, back in 1915, and he remained a coach not only through the 1930s, but also the 40s and into the 50s. Top row, second from left, that's Goy Ladd from Chatham. Next one on the left is Sagasta Harding, who was from North Buxton. Next is Wilfred Boomer Harding that I mentioned earlier. Down in the second row, far left, that's Hyle Stanton, and just below him, sitting on the floor, is his brother Stanton. They were both from Buxton. Second from the left, middle row, that's Earl Flat Chase, who was from Buxton originally, but had been raised in Windsor. After that is Kingsley Turl from Chatham. The next one is Denise Washington, who I mentioned, from Detroit. Beside him is Don Tabron from Detroit. Next to him is Ross Talbot, and then finally Cliff Olby. Bottom row, I already mentioned before, Stanton Robbins. The little younger fellow in the front is Jack Robinson, who was a bat boy, and then Len Harding. Mentioning the names because the names are going to come up again and again. So we'll, you'll have something to visualize when you do that. Just going to quickly show you just a couple of the other sort of team pictures as they went through the seasons at 1935. A core of the players remain, but a few were added here and there. Sitting on the front row, third from the left, is Fergie Jenkins Sr., of course, father of Fergie Jenkins Jr., who was a major league pitcher, a Cy Young Award winner, and Hall of Famer. And up in the top row, the second from the right, is Wellington Willie Shognosh, who was an Anishinaabe man from Walpole Island First Nation. The Black teams used to play. There was a very lively sort of a First Nations sort of baseball culture as well in that period, and so that's how they met Shognosh and invited him onto the team. Continuing on, this is a 1937 picture. Man on the far right, top row, that's Joe Parker. He was also involved with that old team, the Chatham Coloured Giants. In fact, he was the manager of the Giants back in 1915, and he came back in 1937 to manage. He'd also been manager in 1934. This is 1940, the last year that they played together as a team. That year, they had actually recruited a number of white players who joined them. And then finally, this picture taken in 1942 when many of the former Chatham Coloured All-Stars had moved on to white teams. I like this picture because, again, it's a three generations picture. We have some of the older players, Lewis Pryor and Percy Parker, then on the far left, who are both with the Giants. Everyone else on the team in that picture played with the Chatham Coloured All-Stars. And on the far left, bottom left, that's A.B. Scott, who played in the next generation of ball teams that follow the All-Stars, the Taylor AC and the Panthers in the 1950s. Okay. Now, in many ways, it was a remarkable story. A Black team moved into white sporting spaces at a time when racism affected daily lives in Southern Ontario. Many jobs, as well as public places, restaurants, hotels, were off limit to Black people, and that remained the case the entire time the team was together. After the team disbanded, local memory of the team faded, and although the families of the players and members of the Black community would talk about it from time to time, some of the families had kept scrapbooks full of newspaper clippings and a few photos documenting that time in their lives. Beginning in the late 1960s, however, and continuing through the 1970s and early 80s, interest in the story began to revive within the community. Several of the former players shared their experiences to local journalists who wrote little feature articles about the team. In 1980, a project initiated by the Ontario Black History Society and the Multicultural History Society of Ontario secured oral history interviews with about a dozen Black people in Chatham, including 3 former members of the All-Stars. And the ones who spoke with those with that oral history interviewer were Boomer Harding in the middle with the catcher's gear, just to his right, King Turl, and Fergie Jenkins Jr. Fergie Jenkins Sr. He is second from the left in the front row. Okay. Now, this renewed interest was, I believe, tied to a wider growth of primarily Black community-led projects to reclaim and celebrate local Black history in this period, happening in the wake of the North American Civil Rights Movement. The 2 interviewers for the Ontario Black History Society Oral History Project, Vivian Chavis of Buxton and Wanda Milburn, were local Black women who made it clear why they were pursuing these interviews. Chavis said, "I think the Chatham All-Stars and Boomer Harding should be heard of all over Ontario because I think for too long, the accomplishments of Black people have not been made known. This is one of the aims of the group that I belong to." Likewise, Wanda Milburn, who was the younger sister of 3 of the Harding brothers who played on the team, explained, "The All-Stars were a Black team who played in the Depression years and made history, who had a lot of fun together and a lot of trouble together too." As interviewers, they were directly involved in their conversations, and while celebrating the story, they were also very direct in asking questions about the racism the players and team experienced. In an oral history collection, Remembering Jim Crow, the editors remarked on the powerful role of oral traditions in Black communities, noting that efforts of Black elders to preserve a community history and family heritage became powerful tools for maintaining dignity and hope in the grim presence of racial segregation. By talking about the past, African Americans used oral traditions to convey knowledge to the younger generations, such as their enslaved forebears did. And I'm just going to show you a quick, and that's actually a picture on the far left of Wanda Milburn, Wanda Harding. When she was a girl, she was also very active in sports. A lot of the young women in the Black community were. She was involved with track, but they were also very active women's softball teams, girls softball teams. So community sports, even though I'm mostly talking about men, it is something that was part of the entire community. And it's also no accident, I think, that the revived interest in the All-Stars happened just as Chatham native Fergie Jenkins Jr. was having a successful career in the Major League Baseball. A pitcher, he played for the Chicago Cubs in the late 60s and early 70s. He was a Cy Young Award winner and had a streak of 20 win seasons that few have matched. His accomplishments helped foster an interest in the All-Stars, particularly considering Jenkins' own father played on that team. And that's a newspaper article from 1967 when city of Chatham was sort of celebrating the success of Fergie. And that's when I see this sort of spark and interest of the Chatham Coloured All-Stars coming back again. For, of course, he was a reminder that yes, maybe people from Chatham can possibly, make it in professional ball, and led to thoughts about what had happened to that earlier generation who had not had the kind of chances that he did. So I think there's a direct connection between that, between those two. So through the 70s and early 80s, former All-Stars players were interviewed for the local paper. Chatham City Council hosted the surviving players on the 50th anniversary of their 1934 win. But awareness of the story of the Chatham Coloured All-Stars outside of Chatham remained minimal, and it received no scholarly attention. There were brief revivals from time to time, particularly in 2002, when the Blue Jays wore replica Chatham Coloured All-Stars jerseys in the MLB tribute to the old Black leagues. But after that, attention died down again. So there's a picture. This is it was a really big deal for Chatham, the Chatham community, the families of the players. And you see there were two surviving members of the Chatham Coloured All-Stars team at that point. On the left in the Stars outfit is Sagasta Harding, who had since actually spent most of his life in Michigan. In the center is Don Tabron, again, who was from Detroit originally. And next to him is Horace Chase, the son of Earl Flatt Chase, who helped to sort of organize that event. Now, I became connected to this story 8 years ago, and it sort of happened by accident. I was department head at the University of Windsor at the time, and we decided to create a community history medal as a way to try and sort of engage with the local historical groups to sort of recognize community-based history. And so I went to Chatham to give an award to a group that was celebrating, it was creating a website on local involvement in World War I and World War II. And at the presentation, I talked about the changes in history, the way that digital technologies and social media and the web were creating new possibilities for doing history online. And that caught the attention of one of the attendees, Pat Harding, the daughter-in-law of the late Wilfred Boomer Harding. During the coffee and cake reception afterwards, she came up to me and told me that she had a scrapbook on Harding and the Chatham Coloured All-Stars, and she wondered if the history department could help make a website with that scrapbook. And I admit at that point I knew very little about the Chatham Coloured All-Stars. In fact, the only reason I knew about them at all was that the Essex County Black Historical Research Society had put a picture of them up on a website that was highlighting sort of local Black history, and that's the only way I had heard about them at all. I didn't have a lot of experience doing research on Canadian Black history, but I had some experience doing public history, worked on a public history project on history of the head tax, Chinese head tax in Newfoundland. And so I thought that, it was a sort of, at least at start, sort of a beginning point. So I said to Pat, yeah, so, we'd love to help. I turned to colleagues at the Leddy Library, Dr. Heidi Jacobs and Dave Johnson. They had been working with the History Department in digital projects with some of our other classes, and they were very enthusiastic, very talented. So three of us together began this project. We connected back with the community, with the families of the players, with the Chatham Kent Black Historical Society, and the Chatham Kent the Chatham Kent Sports Hall of Fame. And we embarked on a major public history project. I think the website is still up, so you're welcome to take a look at it. I won't go into a lot of detail about it, but this was launched in 2017. It's a multi layer public history project that involves oral histories, involves digitized scrapbooks. It involves curriculum, lesson plans, and sort of bios of all the players. And as we began approaching this project, because we are from outside, we're not from Chatham, we are not from the Black community. It was very important to us that we pay attention to what the families, what the Chatham Kent Black Historical Society really thought was a priority for telling this story. And two things came out fairly quickly. One is that they wanted this story to be accessible. They wanted it to be something that would reach a wide range of the public, and particularly children. They kept saying over and over again how much they wanted this to be in schools. They wanted children to learn about this story. So making it accessible, particularly to a wide audience and school children was a big priority. The other priority was to have oral history components, because there's still many people in the community, offspring of the Chatham Coloured All-Stars, and they really wanted help with this oral history project. So that's basically what we did. So we went ahead and developed this site. We hired students from the University of Windsor who did interviews, working with the Chatham Kent Black Historical Society and sort of finding people to interview. And it was finally launched in 2017. So through this work and through local media attention and social media, we were able to sort of amplify this story in a way that it hadn't done in the past. And again, I'll say that the timing helped us. I'm not saying that we were real geniuses in doing this. It was just that it happened in 2017 when the digital technologies had advanced, that we were able to do this kind of a project. That social media had developed, so we were able to sort of spread it through various constituencies much quickly and faster than we could have before. So the timing, I think, really helped us. If we tried to do it 10 years earlier, I think it would have been much, much harder. And I guess the nice thing about this project too is that it kind of, because we sort of put all this material up on the web, it's there for others to use. So others in the past number of years have been able to take advantage of this. The Chatham Kent Black Historical Society uses it a lot in their community programming. They do a lot of work with kids. Take a couple pictures here. They also, just in the past number of years, began holding a Field of Honor baseball game where descendants of the original players get together every fall and hold a game. In fact, this year's game is this Saturday. So if anyone wants to drive down to Chatham and watch a baseball game, everyone is welcome. Also been some documentaries done. Some of the family members of the players have been interviewed. Fergie Jenkins did a little video with the Blue Jays, sort of highlighting the history of his father and his father's involvement with the team. And last fall, Chatham Coloured All-Stars were inducted into the Canadian Sports Hall of Fame. And that was exciting. And again, it was also exciting because we didn't even do it. It was, you know, it was a class, a schoolroom, a classroom that decided that, you know, that had become engaged with the story and submitted a nomination, and they were accepted. So that was kind of an exciting thing to happen. Picture on the left are our three sons of the Chatham Coloured All-Stars. The far left is Blake Harding, wife of Pat Harding, who first approached me back in 2015. Don Tabron, who is the son of Don Tabron, who's from Detroit. And of course, on the right is Fergie Jenkins Jr. Okay. So after the public history projects were done, we settled down to work on publications. Heidi Jacobs, my colleague at the library, and I both did separate book projects with different approaches and focuses. Hers, published by Biblioasis, came out this spring and explores the story of the Chatham Coloured All-Stars in their 1934 championship year. While mine, Sporting Justice, the Chatham Coloured All-Stars in Black Baseball in southwestern Ontario, 1915 to 1958, as you can tell by the title, is a longer intergenerational social history of baseball in the region, focusing on the All-Stars, but also looking at the deeper origins in earlier Black baseball culture in the region and the impact the All-Stars had on local baseball in the years after they disbanded. Larger themes include memory, gender, and the relationship between sports and social justice in the context of racialized capitalist society. And my sources are primarily oral histories and contemporary newspapers. Okay. For the remainder of my time, I thought I would just sort of reflect on the connections between baseball and social justice and the larger movements for change in the region. Then we'll conclude by bringing it back to memory and how the players themselves expressed and considered what that period in their lives meant. Sports historians have long drawn a relationship between sport and social justice. Besides providing a source of pride for marginalized communities, sport provided a space for Black players to interact with and compete with white athletes, offering, as sports historian Rob Ruck notes, quote, a forum for symbolic political assertion and an arena for real political struggle. The Chatham Coloured All-Stars, simply by moving into white spaces, were asserting themselves, making a claim to legitimacy, the right to be there. That visibility is important, and its meaning is reflected in some of the oral history interviews done with family members of the team, talking about how they felt when the All-Stars won the 1934 title. Although decades had passed, the degree of detail and the intensity of the emotion, the excitement they recalled suggested its significance for them. Wanda Harding, speaking in a 1980 interview, recalled the way everyone was crowded on a downtown Chatham bridge when the team drove back into town after the 1934 win. John Olby, younger brother of All-Stars Cliff Olby, who was interviewed in 2016, said when the All-Stars came riding back into town after winning, people just, quote, hollered and cheered because nothing like that had ever happened in Chatham. They had all kinds of fans, white fans, Black fans. They were all Ontario winners and everybody jumped on the bandwagon, end quote. Although these interviews took place many decades after it happened, the details suggested significance beyond fond memories of a good ball team. And the All-Stars remained visible after their 1934 win. In fact, gained a greater regional profile when they joined a more competitive intermediate A circuit in a tri-county league, playing the strongest teams in southwestern Ontario. As long as they were together and until the end of the 1940 season, they were the premier baseball team of Chatham. Now, that doesn't mean that they didn't continue to face racism and financial struggles and all kinds of things, because they did, but they were still there in public, claiming a space. Another significant development I saw was the way that the All-Stars became more confident and more willing to engage with the politics of organized baseball over time. In their early years as a team and as neophytes in the OBEAA, the All-Stars relied more heavily on local white organizer Archie Sterling to help them deal with problems or conflicts with baseball officials. By the later 1930s, however, they relied less on white allies and were increasingly advocating for themselves, more willing to challenge decisions that went against them or speak out against what they saw as unfair treatment. This may have been due to gaining experience in dealing with baseball officials. Boomer Harding, in a 1980 interview, claimed that over the years that Archie Sterling used to give them advice, on the inside track, as Harding described it. He remarked, "Baseball played off the field is a very different game than the one played on the field. So perhaps with experience and inside advice, they used it to navigate the world more confidently." Also, I expect that moving into that intermediate A circuit in 1935 gave the team some social capital that they didn't have before, because they were playing some of the strongest ball teams in Southern Ontario. Places like London and Strathroy had very, very strong sort of baseball traditions, and they did very well in that circuit. In fact, in 1935, they won the regional championship and really surprised a lot of baseball observers. Now, I see this confidence most particularly in the 1939 season. Managed that year by Len Harding, who was also a player, the All-Stars openly challenged both the Chatham City League and the Ontario Baseball Association over various issues. And most significantly, the All-Stars were speaking directly to the local press about it. That didn't happen in 1933 or 1934, when the team remained publicly silent about racist treatment they experienced. In 1939, however, Len Harding was going directly to the sports editor of the Chatham Daily News. After conflict with the city league over an official's handling of a complaint they had, the All-Stars withdrew from the league entirely. The next day, the Chatham Daily News sports desk published Harding's open letter to the league. While Harding was likely attempting to shape the narrative about what had happened, the point is that this was a new strategy for dealing with an old problem. The 1930 season was indeed a tumultuous one, and the All-Stars also publicly challenged the Ontario Baseball Association over frankly unfair and racist treatment they received in the final series for the Intermediate A title. And if you've seen the latest edition of the CHA's Intersection, I have a short piece that tells a little bit about basics of the story, but you'll get a few more details here. The All-Stars had reached the OBA finals for the first time since 1934, but their run got derailed when a member of the OBA executive set the location for the third and deciding game in the series, because it was a best of three series. Each team had won a game at home, and an executive member from the OBA set the location for the third game at a place that clearly favored the other team. Chatham was playing Meaford on Georgian Bay, and normally the OBA would have placed the tiebreaker game somewhere halfway between the two communities. But in this case, the official chose Hanover, a town only 60 miles from Meaford, but 150 miles from Chatham. There were also some money issues. As Harding claimed, the OBA official wouldn't guarantee that the All-Stars would receive the full amount of compensation for travel that they were owed, because under OBA rules, they were supposed to get a certain amount per mile traveled. And in fact, Harding later disclosed that they hadn't received all the money owed for their previous trip. So we're very nervous about taking another without any guarantees. It's also clear that the OBA executive was able to act this way towards the All-Stars because of who he was, a white man with power. It is also hard to believe that they would have gotten away with treating a white team, say a white team from London, the way they did the All-Stars. When the negotiations with the OBA broke down, Harding went to the Chatham Daily News, which published his account of what had happened and why the team felt the demands were unreasonable. They also spoke about the financial hardships and the time they had to take off work, the lost wages resulting from another long trip north. And in a brilliant public relations move, Harding announced that the All-Stars wanted the opinion of their fans about whether or not they should go to the OBA game as arranged. The paper declared, "Fan opinion and fan opinion alone will determine whether they make the trip tomorrow." In fact, the paper asked people to call the sports desk of the Chatham Daily News or the barber shop where Harding worked with their vote. So, way ahead of social media. They're kind of, trying to engage the public, trying to get sort of buy-in in their decision, whatever it was that they made. And according to the Chatham Daily News, calls flooded into the sports desk, and almost all of them urged the team not to go to that OBA game. After hearing back from the fans, Harding announced that the team would not go to the game unless a new location or fair compensation was secured. Harding explained, "All we ask is a fair break, and everyone knows that we would gladly travel as far as the other fellows, but Hanover, just 60 miles from Meaford, is out of the question." Their story got picked up by the regional press, and soon sports writers from Windsor to Peterborough were weighing in on the controversy. Harding continued to speak to the press, telling the London Free Press that if the OBA had been serious about ensuring the Stars got a square deal regarding finances, they would have made that trip north for that game. Ultimately, there was no happy ending, as the final game was never played. Nevertheless, the OBA was forced to do some damage to control after getting criticized by sports writers for the handling of the case. They also rescinded an earlier statement made by the aforementioned executive member, who had apparently proclaimed to the press in a statement that got picked up by the Canadian Press Wire Service that Meaford had been declared the winner by default. Instead, the OBA announced that earlier statement was incorrect, that the 1939 title would remain undecided. And also in the wake of that Tri-County Baseball League that I mentioned that they were part of withdrew from the OBA entirely for a period of 4 years. We don't have a whole lot of evidence about how people in the Black community were feeling about those events as they unfolded over a period of weeks in October and early November 1939, but there are perhaps a few clues in the responses received to the All-Stars call for opinions about whether or not they should stay or go to Hanover. The Chatham Daily News had printed about a dozen quotes from these calls. While the race of the callers is unstated, there are certainly some differences in how they interpreted the conflict with the OBA. Some attributed it to regional favoritism, saying, well, the OBA, likes the northern region better, that's why they're doing this. Others, however, suggested race was an issue, implying that they thought the OBA didn't want the All-Stars to win. One person said, the OBA didn't want them to win. Why did they invite them into the league in the first place? Others expressed concern about the financial burden on the team. And one caller simply said, brother, I vote no on the question, and so does everyone else in our house. I have to say how remarkable I found these events in 1939 as I read newspaper accounts of the events of the 1939 season, and I was particularly struck by the team's use of the media. That was really, really big and really different from how things had unfolded in the early days of the team. Now, unfortunately, the oral history interviews done with the players tended to focus on questions about the 1934 season, the year they won the championship, not 1939, the year they walked away from one. And that's perhaps understandable. While people recall the racism that the team experienced in 1934, that season also had the satisfying ending that the 1939 season didn't. At the same time, however, the oral histories, both the ones conducted with the players in 1980 and some of the ones we did more recently, reveal an ongoing theme of a model of a Black masculinity, one that resisted ill treatment and commanded respect. As the editors of Remembering Jim Crow note, stories of resistance were central to oral histories of marginalized Black people. They revealed, quote, the extraordinary resilience of Black citizens who individually and collectively found ways to endure, fight back, and occasionally defined their own destinies, end quote. In fact, in one interview, Boomer Harding spoke admiringly about the way that his teammate, Earl Flatt Chase, pushed back against refs who wouldn't call a runner out after he had tagged them at second base. Harding explained that if Chase just lightly tapped the player, the official would often ignore him and call him safe. So to make a point, Harding said Chase would make it clear that he had got the runner out, tagging the runner forcefully before he even got to the bag. Harding added, however, that, quote, we only played what the referees and umpires made us play, end quote, suggesting that physicality of the play was a response to unfair officiating. Harding's teammate, third baseman Kingsley Turrell, expressed a similar admiration for their catcher, Detroiter Denise Washington. He said Washington, quote, wasn't a rough guy, but nobody tried to rough him up because he stood his ground, end quote. He stood his ground, refusing to let people push him around, something he could do on the baseball diamond, if not always in everyday life. Indeed, Turrell suggested Washington carried this confidence that came from a sense of who he was, saying, quote, and he let everybody know wherever we played baseball that he was our catcher, end quote. That he remembered the confidence and strength that he saw in Washington and wanted to share it suggests both the social and emotional power of sport. I see these same themes in later interviews where the children of the players spoke about the power of watching their elders demand and command respect in their everyday lives. And I see it again in some of the interviews we did with people who grew up in the 1950s, who used to watch Black teams that followed the All-Stars, the Taylor AC and the Panthers. Again, models of a heterosexual Black masculinity prevail, one that represented competence, community-mindedness, mutual support, and people who stood their ground in the face of racist treatment. Besides looking at the All-Stars, it is also important to remember that they were part of a community where other people in different ways were advocating for change. Although I'm not aware of any of the Chatham Coloured All-Stars being directly involved in organizations of advocacy or activism, they were certainly connected to people who were. In 1935, someone sent an anonymous letter to the editor of the Chatham Daily News, criticizing both the racism the Black team was experiencing at games and racist coverage in area newspapers. The letter itself is remarkable in a number of ways, and I'll just draw your attention to the way that the author appealed to the wider white community for support. The author assured the readers that the team was grateful for the support they had received, but they needed more than friends in good times. We implore you, the letter said, to attempt to see the game as is going on this summer from an unbiased sporting angle. Asking for understanding in the face of racist treatment, the author said, quote, "All we ask is for Canadian sporting justice from a Canadian sporting town." Now, although we don't know the author was only identified as, quote, "a colored fan," it was someone who had been speaking with the team. It was apparent that they had some inside information about what had been going on that day. So it was likely someone who had some kind of a direct connection with the team itself. They also used the plural first person, we, us, our. And the fact that I could actually identify several plausible possible authors, people with ties to the All-Stars and local advocacy, I think is significant. Possible candidates, a member of the Harding family, who had connections to progressive circles in Detroit. One of the Harding sisters actually worked at a Black law firm where one of the partners was the first Black state senator in the state of Michigan. Another partner became the first Black judge in Michigan. The head of that firm, Charles Roxborough, was brother of John Roxborough, who was a longtime manager of Joe Louis, the boxer. Another possible author is author in the community was Orville Wright, who was a scorekeeper and secretary for the All-Stars, and he had been advocating on behalf of the Black community for many years. As well, another scorekeeper and secretary for the All-Stars, Bethune being a senior, and his daughter Dorothy, they were both local correspondents for the Chicago Defender, America's most prominent Black newspaper at the time. And Bethune Binga's father was actually Jesse Binga, who was the first Black bank owner in the United States. He had a bank in Chicago. So the ties are there, right? And we need to sort of place the All-Stars in this wider environment where things were happening. It's also important to remember that the Black people and families of Chatham were also part of wider networks of Black communities throughout southern Ontario and across the border to Detroit, Cleveland, and elsewhere. A feature of what is described as the Black diaspora, the Black people of Chatham frequently traveled across the border, and people from the US often visited Chatham. And when you have people moving around, the greater the chances are that ideas were moving with them. For example, preachers from AME churches in sort of African Methodist Episcopalian churches in northern US cities would often come to speak at the AME church in Chatham. On Emancipation Day in 1939, just weeks before the conflicts the All-Stars experienced unfolded, visiting clergymen from the BME Church in North Buxton and the First Institutional Baptist Church of Hamtramck in Detroit spoke directly about the need for Black people to unite to work together for greater social and economic positions within society. Reverend Benjamin H. Wright of Detroit affirmed, quote, "The demand of the colored man today is for justice," end quote. Indeed, just a few years later after the war, people from Dresden, Buxton, and Chatham founded the National Unity Association, which went on to push for Ontario's civil rights legislation, which was enacted finally in the early 1950s. In fact, one of the founding members of that organization was Alvin Ladd, who was first cousin of, again, one of the members of the Chatham Coloured All-Stars. So my point is that we remember that the baseball players were part of a community. And if not direct, if there were no direct connections, at least there were parallels in a growing outspokenness, a growing confidence in movements for change. As for the All-Stars and the years that followed, they moved on to white teams, effectively racially integrating baseball in a way that it hadn't been integrated before. And in that kind of role, they, in many ways, I think they gained an even greater profile for Black athletes, because by that point, baseball was kind of reviving in Chatham. And those teams, those integrated Black teams, won a series of provincial championships throughout the 1940s. And, again, with the help of these Black players. But at the same time, there were still limits to that integration, although former members of the Chatham Coloured All-Stars were welcomed onto those teams and played very particular roles. It was also apparent that the younger generation of Black players were not finding places on those teams, suggesting sort of it's okay to accept the ones that we know about, the ones who are tried and true. We know about Chatham Coloured All-Stars, but we're not so willing to take a chance on these younger Black players. And so what happened? Members of the Chatham Coloured All-Stars got together and formed some new Black teams. In 1946, they formed a team called the Taylor AC, which was made up of former members of the Chatham Coloured All-Stars, but a whole generation of new younger players. As that team played for a number of years, and then it was revived again in the 1950s, this time under the name of the Chatham Panthers. And again, members of the Chatham Coloured All-Stars played a leading role in sort of coaching and nurturing that next generation of players. So you see, it's a long, intergenerational, multi-layered story. And I still think that we're just scratching the surface of it. There are still, and one of the things that came up when doing this research is how many teams were out there, Black teams, Indigenous teams, all across Southern Ontario. And their stories haven't been told yet. We were able to sort of stumble upon this. And because they had sort of formed a path and were able to get to the provincial championship, they were able to gain a high profile. But the other teams didn't, and we need to know their stories as well. There's also stories about Black women Black women athletes that we are just learning a little bit about. Ornella Nzudukimana has done some important work on Black women in sport in Ontario in interwar years. She's done some work on Black women track athletes and softball players, but there's still so much more to understand. So I guess to conclude, I just wanted to say that although this is sort of the end of this particular story, there's still so much more that we need to look for. We need to pay attention, and I'm going to continue in other ways to sort of explore some of these other stories. But it's been a very it's been a great honor to be involved in this story. I think I'll leave it there.
Miriam, I just want to say, first of all, thank you very much for a wonderful talk. Just such rich local history that you've been able to write about here. And I'm sure that I've got a ton of questions percolating in my mind, and I'm sure folks here in the audience do as well as those on Zoom. What we'll do for the Q&A period, we've got a ton of time, is I'll just alternate between questions here in person as well as questions from those on Zoom who are interested. But before I do, because I know some folks on Zoom may be wanting to tune out after the formal remarks, my colleague has already shared a discount code with you. If you do want to buy the book and you're on Zoom, just use that discount code, go to the website that has been posted in the chat, and enter that discount code, and you'll get free shipping as well as 20% off. But are there any questions? Maybe we'll start with the in-person audience here. Does anyone in the room have any questions for Miriam? Yeah, hold on, John. Give you the mic. Oh, gracious.
Yeah, I know that you mentioned that source-wise you used newspapers and oral histories, and I was just curious, when looking at sort of a racialized, marginalized group, do you find that oral histories are sort of add a new layer or extra texture to that perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, they were necessary because the newspaper sources were all written by white men, right? And so, and they provided sort of a degree of detail, not so just about sort of what happened, but how people felt about what had happened, how people connected to the story emotionally, what did it mean, what was sort of the significance of it. And the fact that we were able to speak to so many people who had memories, so whether it was sort of direct memories, some of the people we interviewed were actually there, who were, they're quite young, but they kind of remembered, details about that. And others who were, not there, but still, had heard the stories, right? Had sort of sat around the kitchen and heard the, their fathers and their friends sort of sitting around the table talking about it. And absolutely, it's there in the oral history interviews where you get a sense of the sort of the racial politics of the story, and sort of a sense of the way people felt about it. Because again, the newspapers, you're getting sort of these oblique references, and it's not entirely clear what's happening. And they're obviously not talking, for the most part, they're not talking about racial discrimination, but you can sort of see that things were happening, and the oral histories provide that context. Some very valuable ones were done with those former players, were done in 1980, and they're particularly valuable for a couple of reasons. One is because the interviewers, like, they knew the story themselves, they were part of the community, they had watched a lot of things that had happened, and so they would kind of push a little bit the people they were interviewing, and saying, well, like, tell us more about this, because they knew, and so they would encourage them to speak, and had no problem with asking about racism, although they used the term prejudice, and back in 1980 they didn't use the term racism, but they were very clear that they knew, and they knew that story needed to be told, and they did it. That, I think that was a very important part of the story, that they didn't want to just celebrate the good part. They also wanted to say, look, there were some real problems here, and we need to bring that out in the open too. So absolutely, it was a very, very sort of rich kind of perspective that were needed. And again, newspapers written entirely by white men, and you see that too. I mean, that's the kind of sort of a racialized lens that they were using. Like, even if they aren't directly talking about race, sometimes they were, sort of this lens of kind of a whiteness, or ideas of how people should behave. What is the conduct of a baseball player, and you sort of get a sense of, a white baseball player does this, and kind of using that to sometimes criticize the black players. Yeah.
Miriam, I have a question for you. And the photos you used are so poignant, I think, in so many ways, but I think in others, when we look at photos of the past, they can be so misleading, in the sense of that they capture a moment in time.
Mm-hmm.
And when you see the photos of those players, you just see them as baseball players, right? You just see them with their uniforms on, but obviously their lives are so much more complex than just the sport that they played, often as young men. Could you speak at all to their backgrounds outside of the sport of baseball? Like, what sort of work were they doing at this time? I noticed there's kind of a North American corridor, sort of in the Detroit area, where these players are being recruited from.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything you can speak about, geographical relationships and class backgrounds, so on and so forth?
Yeah, well, most of the players from Chatham came from people from Chatham will know Chatham's East End. It was sort of the east side of the neighborhood, by the railroad tracks, and an industrial area. It was largely, again, sort of a very racialized space. Black people were generally not allowed to live outside of that. They weren't welcomed outside of that. So it was a neighborhood that was it was a working class neighborhood, mixed Black, but primarily a place where Black people lived. And as was the case for Black people all over Canada, they were marginalized in the labor force. Black men mostly worked in sort of a casual labor, or in Chatham, many of the young men that played on the baseball team worked as baggage carriers at the hotel. And those weren't, those were not salary jobs. Back in the 30s, they were mostly, working for tips. And so, yeah, all of them through the 1930s are sort of living at, working at very low paid jobs and very insecure jobs. And that's why that conflict I talked about in 1939 was such a big deal for them. Because they said we can't afford to take time off. We're having to travel all over the southern Ontario to play baseball, and that was a real hardship. Some of them did eventually move into better positions in the 40s, and that happened largely, I think, because of the war. Right, war opened up opportunities, and so some were able to get jobs in factories. Some got jobs with the city, working in sanitation. Boomer Harding got a job as a mail carrier. But others, stayed in jobs, as, some continued to work for hotels, some sort of remained in those other kinds of positions. There was, again, a lot of movement across the border. I already mentioned before that this was a very kind of a, so we call the Black diaspora, right? That is the borders are very fluid for Black communities in Southern Ontario and the U.S. There's a lot of movement. Sort of families are moving back and forth. They're going over to Detroit for work. They're coming back again. And so quite a few of the members of the Chatham Coloured All-Stars went to the U.S. and worked. Hyle Robbins, who I mentioned, who's from Buxton, Sagasta Harding, both actually just shortly after the 1934 win, both of them moved to Michigan and stayed there working factories for the rest of their lives. The two guys who were originally from Detroit, eventually went back, although they stayed for a number of years. I mean, Don Taborn stayed in Chatham for 2 years and then went back to Chatham went back to Detroit and worked in the auto industry and then became an electrician. Denise Washington actually stayed in Canada he's actually stayed in Canada for 5 years. He stayed in Chatham for 3 years, and then a baseball team from Strathroy recruited him, and he went and lived in Strathroy and coached baseball for a couple of years, and then finally went back to Michigan. So the appeal of the border was big, and a number of them went there to find jobs. But very much marginalized throughout this time period. And it had an impact on their ability to run the baseball club. I mean, that was sort of one of the challenges for them, particularly as they entered in the more competitive, intermediate A circuit, that they had to spend a lot more money traveling, right? They had to move. They were doing a lot more sort of traveling to play baseball, and that was always a strain for them. But it's really the war. The war that opens up things for Black people. Black women, again, the same, working in service industry, much more likely to be working outside the home than white women were. Having to sort of supplement their income through, taking in laundry and sewing and that kind of thing.
I got a question for you, Miriam, from Alec Maveris, coming from Toronto.
Mm-hmm.
Picking up on this kind of the journalism aspect or the press aspect that you spoke about, and the kind of difficulties that the Black communities found in getting coverage within the white press.
Mm-hmm.
There's obviously a very rich history of Black journalism in the area, going all the way back to Marianne Shadd. So what's the kind of what's the Black press like at this time? Is it very small? Is it even existent in the 1930s? And what sort of things is the Black press covering? Sports being, I'm sure, one amongst many others. Yeah,
well, within Canada, there was the Dawn of Tomorrow, right, which was a newspaper. It was based in London, Ontario, formed in the 1920s, and it was covering a little bit of sports. It it started out sort of as a weekly newspaper, and then after the original founder died, it was published for, once a month or every couple of months. And certainly in the beginning, they were covering actually a lot of sports, particularly in the 1920s. Teams from London, teams from Chatham, and they were, and again, quite, like they like to sort of celebrate, the barriers broken, there was a lot on, in the 1920s, there was a player from London named Harry Coursey, who was, he was a ball player that began playing on white teams in the 1920s in London, and he actually played for the forerunner of the London Majors in 1926. They were called the London Braves then. Yeah, he was a pitcher in this league, and so Don Tomorrow covered him quite a bit. Other than that, the sort of connections were with Black newspapers in the States. So there would be sort of Chatham correspondence for the Chicago Defender, and later, when other papers in Michigan started up, in Michigan Chronicle, for example, they did that as well. But yeah, certainly throughout this time period in the 30s, as I mentioned before, Bethune-Binga Sr. and his daughter were the Chatham correspondents, and when they wrote about baseball and submitted it to the Chicago Defender, they talked about the first, this is, first Black team to win, this is a major accomplishment. The white press didn't. I mean, they said, Chatham Coloured-All-Stars win, but they didn't sort of acknowledge that there was anything different or distinctive about a Black team winning. They were the ones that sort of said, this is something that's worthy of paying attention to. So yeah, so it wasn't a whole lot of Black press in Southern Ontario, but certainly people in Chatham and from the other Black communities all over Southern Ontario, they were connected to that press through the American publications.
Are there any questions in the room? I've got a few, but I don't want to hog up too much time. Yeah, just hold on one quote. I'll give you the microphone.
Thank you for this. I lived in Chatham from 95 until a few weeks ago, and I'm struck by a number of how many names I recognize from, in particular. Do you know if the man named Ladd on that team stayed in town and played? Because a tennis group that I belonged to, a member of our group was Art Ladd, who passed away last year, but we play for the Art Ladd Memorial medal every week, but he never mentioned it for years. And anytime that I spoke with him, never said anything about the history. And I wonder how much integration kind of changed the story or suppressed the story of the uniqueness of the Black team and gave an excuse for people kind of not to talk about that as a.
Not talk about it, yeah, that's a good question. And in terms of the Ladds, like there were several sort of, like they were all related, but there were several different families of the Ladds. One, like Goy Ladd, he played with the Chatham Coloured All-Stars throughout the whole time. He was also involved in coaching, and in fact he coached a provincial, I think it was in 1970, Kent Concretes, I think, he coached a team to a provincial title. So he remained active, and his team was primarily white. Actually, he was involved in that. And so the integration did happen like in the 50s, and I think it was happening more through the service clubs. The service clubs were providing more kind of recreation for young people, and so a lot of the younger Black children were sort of being incorporated into that. And in terms of why the Chatham Coloured All-Stars story really kind of faded away, except amongst the families, racism, I mean, just, Black stories just aren't celebrated, they just weren't, they were sort of forgotten. Perhaps some discomfort, because when you're telling the story of Chatham Coloured All-Stars, it's also telling some difficult stories. And that's one of the things that was coming out in this, like in the late 60s through the 70s, when journalists were interviewing the former players who were still alive. And they were telling all kinds of stories. They weren't just telling the nice stuff. they were saying this, these things happened to us, and talking about getting called names and kind of the racism they experienced when they were traveling, the fights that were breaking out in the stands and all kinds of things. And, they told the whole thing, and that can't have always been comfortable, I don't think, for people in Chatham. It's, it's not, you can't put it in a nice little package. It's nice little story. Black team won and things were better after that. Well, they weren't. And there are uncomfortable parts about that story too. And it's not something that's, it's always easy to hear.
Miriam, I want to pick up on that a bit in this next question. And I noticed in one of your photos, and you spoke about it as well, as how the Toronto Blue Jays ended up using some replica uniforms in the Chatham Coloured All-Stars in 2002. And the question that came in made mention of MLB The Show, which is a video game, also made use of the or actually incorporated the Chatham Coloured All-Stars into the game to be played, or a team to be played. So there's clearly an ongoing interest in using the story of the Chatham Coloured All-Stars within Major League Baseball and even by specific teams. Could you maybe speak to it all, what you think, the Major League Baseball or what Major League Baseball is, why they find the Chatham Coloured All-Star story so appealing, and why they keep coming back to it over and over again when speaking about the history of baseball?
Well, partly it came about like the 2002 event. Partly it was happening because American teams were doing it, right? They were, the Negro Leagues, right? That they were sort of celebrating that history, and the Blue Jays didn't have one, because others were sort of celebrating the teams, the Detroit Stars and the Tigers and all that kind of thing. And Toronto Blue Jays didn't have anything, sort of equivalent. So I think they kind of latched on to that. There was also actually some community connections that sort of fostered that. Like there was somebody within Chatham, I forget the details, but had some connections with the Blue Jays and kind of sort of pushed the story and sort of encouraged them to do that. And so another interesting thing about that story, though, is that, like, I think initially the Blue Jays didn't quite know what, I guess, the power of the story, because initially they had actually done the same thing in 2001, where they had made replica uniforms, and the players played, but they played at an away game, like I think it was in New York or somewhere, and so it wasn't in Chatham, and people from Chatham couldn't go see it. And there was a huge uproar in Chatham because the families, they're saying, you did this and you didn't invite us. We want to be there. This is really important to us. And so Blue Jays kind of did, okay, mea culpa, and sort of went, okay, well, we'll do it again next year and we'll invite everybody down. And that's the pictures that you saw. So I think initially, I don't think they realized that the kind of meaning, that it had. And but I think that perhaps that sort of response surprised them. There was like 300 people from Chatham took buses, down to see that game. I think really weren't aware of the way that kind of the emotional attachment that people had, and I think they saw that and were able to sort of recognize the kind of kind of the social value of supporting that kind of thing. So yeah, I think that it's and again, it's an easy story, right? It's kind of a, the celebratory side. Like, I don't think that the Blue Jays, really go deeply into the ugly part of the story, the difficult times, the racism that continued, far, after 1934. The hubby story part is appealing, I think, in a way too. I think maybe that's part of it too. It's sort of an easy thing to sort of latch onto.
Maybe I'll just ask one more question.
Sure.
And we can wrap things up, Miriam. I noticed there's in some ways a lot of contradictions in the story of the Chatham Coloured All-Stars. This question I'm just sort of riffing here comes from Peter Urquhart. He's a professor here in Comm Studies at Laurier. And by contradictions, I guess I'm thinking, this is a Canadian baseball team, yet there's a number of Americans playing on the team. we sort of see Canada's game, quote unquote, as hockey. Yet there's also a long history of excellence in baseball, particularly in the Black community. His question is very broad, but it sort of gets at the nexus between race and nation and sports. I'm wondering if you've kind of thought through any of those ideas and how those three things kind of come together and impact the story of the Chatham Coloured All-Stars.
Well, I think one of the things that like, I think, and this is an issue with in the United States as well, is there's been sort of a whiteness of baseball, right? Sort of a whitewashing of baseball. It's sort of tied into sort of mythology of the origins of baseball. In Canada, we have it too, the Beachville story, right? That, supposedly first game taking place there. Still very white, right? But from what we can tell, Black people have been playing baseball in Canada for as long as white people have. And I think part of the what I was talking about before about sort of moving into white spaces, right? In some ways it always had been a Black space, or at least it always been a Black game, but sort of the perception was that it wasn't. And so that's why sort of them sort of moving into, moving into, playing exhibition games. So they would organize games and, invite, Black teams from Detroit to come and play. In many ways, that was sort of a challenge, is sort of the perception of nation, of baseball. In ways that challenge those kinds of ideas. And I think that was one of the sort of the compelling parts of the story, is that it on the one hand, it's always been a Black game, but on the other hand, the sort of the power of sort of the white narrative has overshadowed it. And it's into larger questions of, particularly in Canada, we have issues with, who is a Canadian and what is a Canadian sport, and that's why hockey and whiteness have been such a big part of our narrative. It sort of undermines that. Leads to these larger questions, and sort of helps to sort of decenter in a lot of ways. So these sports history narratives have been so much part of our history and our culture.
I think it's an excellent place to stop. Let's give Miriam one more round of applause, please. Well, Miriam, just want to say thank you very much for traveling here to Waterloo, and thanks to her sister for helping her drive here from London. We very much appreciate it. For those online, as I've already said, you're more than welcome to buy a book at the website address that is in the chat. Do make use of the discount code that is provided for you. That will give you free shipping. For those here in the room, Murray, again, from WLU Press, is here to sell books for you. The book is for 20% off, actually, so it's cheaper than you'll find if you were to buy it later on. So do buy it here. And of course, I'm sure Miriam is more than happy to sign some copies for you, so you won't be able to get that anywhere else either. Our next event is going to take place at the end of October. We're actually going to be doing something a little bit different. We're going to be doing a panel discussion. It's going to be a discussion on a universal basic income in Canada, what the prospects of that might be, and what that might look like in practice, given so many of the problems we have with homelessness, with poverty in the region and across Ontario as well as Canada. That's going to take place on October 27th. It's going to be in the afternoon, so for those folks that are working, you might have to catch it later on YouTube, but it will be at 1:00 p.m. on October 27th. Thank you all for coming, whether on Zoom or here in person. I hope you all have a great night, and we'll see you soon.